and the level of violence is spiralling. Take Birmingham, England's second city. Gun crime here has risen a staggering 500% in the last few years, and it's a picture that's replicated across the country, with teenage gangs killing one another over tribal loyalties based on nothing more than which postcode they come from. This is the story of two postcodes in Birmingham, where a new breed of gangster has taken over and where battles over turf fueled a full-blown riot that led to a brutal double murder which shocked the nation.
Letitia was a good girl. This is as bad as it gets. A part of me died when Letitia died.
This is the heart of Birmingham, which is England's second city, and standing up here and looking down on the city centre, you're really struck by just how much money has been pumped into Birmingham. Beautiful new buildings in the heart of the city, but it's not like that throughout Birmingham. In fact, if you head off in that direction towards the Aston and Lascelles districts, you'll find two areas that have not only been racked and scarred by poverty and a real lack of opportunities, but they've also been racked by gang warfare. According to the West Midlands Police, teenage gun crime has trebled here in the last few years. I wanted to know how the gang problem was affecting young people, so I went to the B19 and B6 districts, where gang violence is endemic. Teenagers here are so scared of gang reprisals that they didn't want to show their faces on camera.
All these other youngsters that are joined these gangs, you see, for their own protection, they're carrying guns, man. If you look at them in a bad way, or if you say something in a bad way, they'll retaliate, you see.
People forming more gangs to protect themselves from the new gangs. So it keeps on going and going, so it becomes gangs and gangs. There's 12-year-olds getting shot.
The gangs make much of their money from crack and heroin dealing, and they've become so bold that these dealings often take place in broad daylight on the high street. Around the country, gang territories are increasingly based around postcodes, and so-called postcode wars are believed to have been at the heart of a senseless gang-related murder in March 2007. It happened in Birmingham's busy town centre and started when two young students fell out over gang loyalties. Dwayne Barnes was a young college student, but it was a chance encounter here on New Street in the heart of Birmingham's shopping district that was to have fatal consequences. Dwayne bumped into one of his sworn enemies, and as soon as he saw him, he knew he was in trouble. Eyewitnesses say they saw him running off in that direction towards St. Philip's Cathedral with his assailants carrying a knife. Dwayne Barnes ran to this bus shelter where he must have thought he was safe, having run nearly half a mile from where the attack had begun in New Street in the centre of town. But he came out to see if the coast was clear, and again, who knows, perhaps by chance, his assailants were driving by in a car. They grabbed a hold of him and they dragged him out into this main street in the middle of the afternoon at around 3 o'clock, and they just started to stab him to death. And what makes this even more horrific is that the murder took place right under the noses of a major college building here. Dwayne Barnes died in hospital 2 days after the frenzied attack. When the case went to court in September 2007, one of his attackers, 17-year-old Michael Hales, claimed his rivalry with Dwayne was because they were in different gangs. The jury found Hales and one of his co-defendants guilty of manslaughter. A third co-defendant was convicted of murder. Michael Hales came from the B6 Aston area, which, along with B19, is among the most violent in the city. The two areas are the strongholds of the notorious gangs, the Burger Bar Boys and the Johnson crew. Their turf is divided by Birchfield Road, a dual carriageway known as Birmingham's Checkpoint Charlie. I'm going to cross the border to see how gang warfare is affecting ordinary people.
It has become more violent than it is.
Has that been from people attacking you?
Yes, yes.
And what happens? I mean, they use knives or...?
Yeah, they use knives. knives and blades, axe, everything they use. It's like a volcano ready to erupt.
Do they sort of rule the streets, these gangs?
Well, of course they are the ruler because they're young and they don't care about anything.
You don't get a sense of a sort of police sort of presence?
They are not afraid of God. How can they be afraid of police?
We're headed just down to what is effectively the border between Lozells, the area just back there, and Aston. And if you're from Lozells and you cross this border and go into Aston, you're likely to get attacked. It seems amazing that you have something that most people around here do regard as a kind of unofficial border. It's almost between sort of Palestinians crossing into Israeli areas and vice versa. There is a very strong sense in which, you know, you belong in one area, not into another, and that the two sides are enemies. We're going through the underpass now, which is the official border. We've had a lot of knifings, a lot of shootings, and people affected on this side in Aston just as much as they have been in Lozells. And again, victims all of the so-called postcode violence and postcode gangs. The government's own crime survey estimates that some 60,000 people are stabbed or knifed in the UK every year, the equivalent of 160 a day, and that many of the attackers and the victims are teenagers. I wanted to know why more and more of our young people are involved in gang-related street crime, so we spoke to Tony, who's been a gang member for most of his life. He puts it down to a combination of peer pressure and the need to belong.
You know, came from a broken home, family on a low income, one-parent family, no money, wanted what every normal child had, decent pair of trainers and clothes. Family couldn't provide that, so I ended up on the streets looking for it for myself from round about the age of 10, 11.
Tony's views on the motives of young gangsters are chilling and sad.
The media portrays, unless you're wearing new clothes with fashion labels, unless you're driving a brand new car, then you're almost excluded from society unless you have these accessories. And without these accessories, you feel like an outcast in society. The power has been taken away from the people by the government, so you make your own power, and your own power is normally drugs, guns, and money. If we had to shoot people, we would shoot people. If people had to die, people had to die, and that's just the way it was.
And even behind bars, the gang violence can be deadly. According to Tony, warders at Birmingham's Winson Green prison remain fearful of violence breaking out between inmates associated with the rival Burger Bar Boys and Johnson crew.
If you maybe come into Winson Green prison, at reception you'd be asked if you're a Johnny or you're a Burger. And depending on your answer, would depend on what wing you went on. They never mixed on the same wing, because if they had mixed them on the same wing, then the violence would have been instantaneous. Your Johnnies and your Baps were forever, it seems, trying to kill each other over status. I mean, I've witnessed firsthand the depth of hatred between two rival gangs.
This hatred has been fueled by turf wars over crack cocaine dealing and heightened by the emergence of firearms. Eventually, this feud between the rival gangs culminated in a shocking double murder. There had been tit-for-tat attacks between the two gangs over a number of years because of rivalry over the drugs trade in their areas. But it all came to a head when an associate of the Burger Bar Boys was murdered. And this is what led to one of the most horrific murders this city has ever seen. Coming up, the real story behind the machine gun slayings of two innocent teenage girls, and how an even more dangerous and fearless generation of teenage gangsters is taking a grip of Britain's inner cities. I'm Raggy Omar, and in this series I'm looking at criminal gangs in Britain. I've been mainly looking at foreign gangs that have come into Britain illegally, but in this programme I've discovered that some of the most violent, feared and deadly gangs in the UK are themselves British and are operating right under our noses. Teenage gangsters are killing one another simply because they come from a different part of town. And I'm in Birmingham, where a territorial war led to an infamous murder that proved a watershed in British gang history. Like the rest of the country, I was shocked when I heard about the shooting, but as I dug deeper into the story, I discovered just how complex gang life has become. It all started with the killing of Johann Martin, an alleged member of the Burger Bar Boys, a gang based in B19 in the west of the city. Their bitter rivals are the Johnson crew, who have their HQ in B6 in the east of the city. Detective Superintendent David Murfield led what was to become one of the biggest operations in West Midlands police history.
The death of Johann Martin, who was killed over in West Bromwich in his car in the street during the evening. He started a chain of events.
The Burger Bar Boys believed the murder had been committed by the Johnson crew and began planning a reprisal attack. On New Year's Day 2003, less than a month after Johann Martin's killing, word reached the Burger Bar Boys that members of the Johnson crew had been publicly dissing them on stage at a club called RB's in Birmingham. The Johnson crew members went to a party behind a hair salon in the city where they were spotted by a member of the rival Burger Bar Boys. He phoned his fellow gang members who sped straight over. Also at the party that night were 4 teenage girls all dressed up for a big night out and unaware that they were about to become unwittingly entangled in a gang feud. Armdeep Bassi is an investigative journalist and a leading authority on Birmingham's gang culture.
The girls would have been stood out here, just, getting some fresh air. The party was coming to a close. It was the early hours. People were beginning to make their way home. There was probably, a group of people sort of milling outside.
They were standing outside here, very close to where we are now, getting some fresh air, trying to decide where to go now because it was late. Bear in mind, they were only young girls, 17, 18. They didn't really know the streets that well. They were unsure where to go.
That was when a red Mondeo containing members of the Burger Bar Boys arrived at the end of the street.
The car drove along here slowly, the red Mondeo.
Nobody got out of the Mondeo. Instead, the windows were open and witnesses recall seeing, the outline of a machine gun.
The weapon was put out of the window and the trigger pulled, and the bullets sprayed along these walls.
37 bullets were discharged from there.
The gun itself, the MAC-10, is one of the most, feared weapons in the world. Very high-powered, 1,000 rounds a minute. When you've got a gun like that, machine gun like that, you just pull the trigger and that person dies.
The gang had missed their intended targets because, unknown to them, the Johnson crew members had remained inside the building during the botched attack.
The Mondeo sped off, out onto the Trinity Road and disappeared. The MAC-10 machine gun was never recovered.
Instead, the 4 girls had become innocent victims of the gang war. 17-year-old Letitia Shakespeare and 18-year-old Charlene Ellis lay dead on the floor, while the other 2 girls were left injured. If you really are trying to target one person that you want to kill, the last thing you would do is use a machine gun, especially one that's nicknamed Spray and Pray. And it just leaves me thinking, what on earth were the gang thinking of?
The general intelligence has been overwhelming. A major investigation commenced, one of the biggest that West Midlands has ever undertaken. We then had a stroke of luck finding the car itself, the red Mondeo. They tried to burn it out, but they'd been unsuccessful. In that vehicle was a bullet, and that bullet was linked to some of the bullets casings found here. So we could link that car with the scene. We could then link that car with Nathan Martin, the brother of Johan Martin. And then, using telephone forensics, we were able to piece together all the people that were involved in that.
Within weeks of the killing, the police arrested 4 men. Rodrigo Sims, the man who had tipped off his fellow Burger Bar boys about the Johnson crew's presence at the party. Nathan Martin, Michael Gregory, and Marcus Ellis, who was incredibly the half-brother of one of the victims.
There's a bit of a pattern as far as gangland Birmingham is concerned. I don't think it's peculiar to Birmingham, but you find that a lot of the people involved in the gang are often related. And in a lot of cases, the 2 people from the same family won't even know they're from the same family. Charlene Ellis, one of the victims, turned out one of the guys who was eventually convicted for the murder, Marcus Ellis, was actually her half-brother. Up until that point, the only people who knew of any kind of gang problem in Birmingham were people from Birmingham, but this brought it into the sort of national and international spotlight, really.
Its members are ruthless, shooting even members of their own family.
The 4 girls who were shot were not the intended targets.
The problem has got so bad.
The violence has to stop.
Convictions of these men went a long way to convincing the community, as much as anything, that if they go out with a gun with the intention of using that weapon and they're discovered and convicted, they'll go to prison for a long time. Rodrigo Sims was inside. He was making phone calls and planning what was going on. He had no involvement in the shooting whatsoever. He went to prison for 28 years. I mean, that had a massive impact on the gangs themselves.
After a trial lasting 6 months, the 4 men were found guilty of the double murder and sentenced to 132 years in jail. The convictions of the 4 Burger Bar gang members were followed by a huge crackdown on gangs in Birmingham. 20 other leading members of the Burger Bar Boys and Johnson crew were jailed, as an entire generation of gangsters were locked up for a total of almost 500 years. But the police crackdown, which was meant to bring an end to the gang problem, ironically made the situation even worse. The absence of gang structures created a void that's been quickly filled by a newer breed of gangster, younger, more volatile, and prepared to kill over territory. Everyone I've spoken to says that, if anything, the situation is worse today in Birmingham than it has been in previous years. And more than that, the situation is more chaotic and more unpredictable. You have younger men, in fact, nothing more than boys, carrying guns, more prepared to use violence. And there seems to be no rhyme or reason to when they resort to violence. It can be over the slightest trivial matter. It's no longer about criminal enterprise. It's about who I am and respecting me.
You've got a lot of younger gangsters now who have no real affinities or loyalties to anybody. It's become much more dangerous. Everybody wants to be that Billy Blanco from the Bronx now. There's no honour, if there was any in the first place, among thieves. It's a free-for-all. I don't care about your reputation. I've got a gun just like every other punk's got a gun, and I'll use it.
The police have their work cut out because new gangs constantly form, merge and break up as allegiances change, so they have no idea how many gangs there are now in the city. According to one local police officer, it's like wrestling with smoke. In the last few years, the postcodes that were the power base of the Burger Bar Boys and the Johnson crew have witnessed countless gang-related shootings and stabbings. So this is the Lascelles district of Birmingham, and in fact this is the high road to this area, and it's been the scene of 3 major riots in the last 20-odd years, in the early 80s, in 81 and 85, but most recently 2 years ago, in which this whole area was racked by warfare, basically, is the only way to sort of describe it. It's believed that the 2 days of riots in Lascelles were exploited by postcode gangs to carve up more drug territory. In the midst of the carnage, 2 young men lost their lives. What you had in the riots was buildings and properties and shops burnt for 48 hours. You had torched properties up and down the high street of Lascelles as the violence just continued unabated. The killings have continued. Last November, a series of what are believed to be gang-related incidents shook the city once again. So about a year ago, you had violence being conducted by gangs up and down this whole street for about a week, in which there were tit-for-tat attacks. And it started with the stabbings of 2 Asian men. And then later the same day, in a side street not far from here, you had a young man celebrating his birthday simply just outside his house, and he was shot dead. Later the same day, a house was shot at. Again, in Lascelles, you had a man who walked into a shop and just simply shot and killed another man. Many of the young people I met in Lascelles told me the shootings take place for 3 reasons. The 3 R's: revenge, revenue, and respect. And those who have followed the rise of Birmingham's gang crime can't see an end to the violence.
I think it's going to get worse. As pessimistic as that sounds, I just think it's the natural progression of things. With every generation, you want to be better than the last lot. Violence now is used for the slightest offence. You know, you could be, as a matter of, you looked at me the wrong way. It could be anything. It could be petty. It could be somebody stepped on somebody else's toes.
I could get a gun for you in 1 hour. That's how easy it is. Guns have been here for a long time, but it's just the case where in the old days, it was like the older criminals who had the guns. And obviously now it's the youngsters are getting the guns, and the youngsters are the ones to fear.
There's a lot of speculation about the factors drawing young people into gangs. What I'd call as television sort of violence feeds into this idea that, yeah, you can stab someone, nothing's going to happen. Reality is completely the reverse. All you need to kill someone with a knife is you need a blade that's only about 1.5 inches long. You know, for every hip-hop video I see about guys, you know, going tooled up and blazing away in a drive-by, I wonder how many of those people making the videos have ever seen someone shot dead in the streets, has ever been to an emergency A&E unit and seen doctors trying to work on someone with their guts half spilling out, huge loss of blood, going into convulsions. I still remember the first time I saw someone who'd been stabbed and someone who'd died. And if you see someone who's been a victim of gun violence or a victim of knife violence, it would shake any sense of bravado and machismo out of you for life. Next time on Crime Invasion, the real Gone in 60 Seconds, the high-speed crime wave taking over the UK.